thanks to everyone. This is a great turnout. I totally appreciate it. As you can see, I should also apologize for the low production values. I had to become a historian because I don't really have any skills. Another thing, I'm kind of nervous tonight. I've actually written up some speaking notes. Two of my teachers are here, Jim Struthers. I'd just like to acknowledge you. Thank you for the education. I'd also like to recognize John Wadland, and without getting too emotional, back 30 years ago, as a kid off the turnip truck from Northern Ontario, I decided to go camping with my buddies. And some of my friends from the turnip truck days were here, and I'd just like to acknowledge them too. But what I did was, some friends of mine and I had canoed down the Missinaibi Moose River several times, and we had the bright idea that it would be awesome to walk to Moosonee during the winter. So I was in Honors Canadian Studies, and I talked to John about, hey, maybe this can be a project. Like, it'll take 3 weeks, I'll be back, writing out the paper, everything will be great. Well, turns out it took 6 weeks. I missed reading break. And I was in honors, so that ship had sailed. But John was kind enough to go to bat for me in the Senate, got me half of my tuition back, no academic penalty, and I was invited back. I never did, I just sort of continued on my own, but 30 years later, I'm still grateful for that, so thank you. Spend the day today on campus. This morning I went jogging around, and I was saying to a few people this morning, like, I remember how beautiful this place is, but you don't remember beauty until you actually experience it again. So those of you who work here and study in this environment, congratulations, because University of Regina is like an industrial warehouse compared to this place. So thanks again. Now, I guess what I want to talk about, I'm going to tell you about, like I said, clearing the plains and clearing the air. Probably a little bit about my story, but also talking about stories to some extent. And what I wanted to do, and like I said, Trent was the first place, and with John's help, it was the first recognition I had. Both of my parents, neither of my parents actually finished high school. World War II broke out, things happened. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. And so even as a student, I was kind of playing it by ear. I wasn't really sure what I should be doing and stuff like that. And Trent was the first place I really felt that, we could do something with it. So after I left to go camping for a couple of years, my best friend Mike from high school gave me a job in Manitoba working for the gas company. Give us a wave, Mike. Yeah, thank you. And working for the gas company, driving a Smurf blue van through Winnipeg, I used to pass by the Hudson's Bay Company Archive, I don't know about on a daily basis, but Hudson's Bay Archives is a beautiful Art Deco building. And after my experiences camping, it's like, dang, I want to get in there and I want to see what's in those archives. And the way I got into those archives was by signing up for grad school at University of Manitoba. I ended up doing a qualifying year because I really didn't have any history courses other than Dale Stannon's History of New France class from here. And I spent my master's and PhD working in the Hudson's Bay Company Archives, that beautiful place, trying to understand at least the documentary version of Indigenous white relations in Western Canada. Another thing I was trying to do, and I guess this is a little bit cocky, I set I guess a high standard for myself. I tried to answer a big question. And really what that question is how did we evolve, we being white society, because back in the old days, Canada was like overtly racist and people of color weren't allowed to immigrate. How did white society and Indigenous societies, how did their histories so diverge? And the way I sort of thought about that, I had the good fortune to work for Dr. Q Young. He's an epidemiologist at University of Manitoba, he's now at U of T. And I realized that if you looked at health, you could almost use health, or the lack of it, as a measure of oppression. How well you're doing in a society is really going to reflect upon your health outcomes. So I took on a big question and spent many decades working on it. Probably 20, maybe 25 years. This is like the culmination, I guess, of my career so far. It also took me many years to finish my degree. I will admit I'm a slow thinker and pretty lazy. Even in my early days working as a research assistant in community health, I knew that health was a reflection of economics, as I said. And in the case of Indigenous Canadians, that poor health was a reflection of poverty and marginalization. Today, with SPIRU, that very long population health group, We call those, we describe those forces as the social determinants of health, and there are probably courses here at Trent that talk about that. These are things like housing, social economic status, education, safety and security. These are really the predominant forces that shape our health histories. And it's also known in sort of the population health literature, 75% of our health outcomes, 75% of the arc of life and eventually death, because it's all going to happen to us once, 75% of those forces are social forces. Only a quarter of our medical lifespan is actually controlled through medicine and physicians and hospitals, like that type of intervention. So often we talk about, you could build a hospital on every corner of our poor Indigenous neighborhood in Regina, North Central, and it really wouldn't make that much of a difference. So the way we've been organizing society with building hospitals and politicians can have a ribbon cutting ceremony, that kind of thing, it's really a very short-term decision. We're not dealing with the long-range thing. We're not trying to cut back on the flow of people going to hospitals. And for an example here in Ontario, I've been keeping an eye on things because even though the world has gone insane and Saskatchewan is an economic engine and Ontario is now in the hurt locker. About 4 or 5 years ago, Don Drummond, who's the chief economist, I think at the TD Bank, wrote a report on the sustainability of government services in Ontario. And I've had my health study students look at the health chapter in that. It's very easy to read. And what Drummond and his team said was that if we continue like this, if we continue to build hospitals, we will run physically, like literally, run out of money because all of the money in our economy will be directed to hospitals. And what he proposed was, we have to go in the, I guess in the pop health field, we have to go upstream to the source and deal with things, much cheaper things to deal with, like education, housing, safety in communities, that kind of thing. That's what's going to keep people out of hospitals and make our systems more sustainable in the long run. We also know that the poorest and most marginalized use the medical system the most. And if we as society can keep them out, well, that's, like I said, that's going to go a long way to bending down that curve of healthcare spending and make it more sustainable in the long run. So fixing those social issues, and that's really what I do. I teach in kinesiology, so it's students who identify themselves as pre-med. All they have to do is check off a box and then they hassle me for higher marks. But also, so it's people who want to work in the health professions, pre-nursing, pre-sports. What I tell them is that, it's not necessarily the electron transport chain or Krebs cycle that's going to be important to you getting into medical school. It's going to be your understanding of how social forces affect people's health. And these days with medical school interviews and whatnot, that's what people are doing. They don't ask somebody chemistry questions, they ask them if they understand or they have an inkling about how society works. And in Saskatchewan, for example, just an example of different kinds of policies. Our provincial government, and my spouse is an executive in the provincial government, we often get into it at home. Our provincial government has spent $65 million on a consulting company called John Black & Associates to develop or to implement something called lean management strategy. And that's based on Toyota auto production in the context of a hospital. So they've already spent $65 million, and what they're doing is they're trying to make the operation of a hospital more effective. So moving a door, moving tables and that kind of thing. But there really hasn't been a discussion about stemming the flow of people to the emergency room. And I think that's really where we got to go. Another aspect in Saskatchewan that I've been hearing about is something called hotspotting. There was about 24 very high-end users of emergency rooms. In fact, there was one person in the newspaper was called the $2 million man, because in 1 year, this homeless person with addiction issues and mental health issues and a whole bunch of other things cost the medical system $2 million. Okay? So if we could provide that person with housing, to help him deal with his addictions, we as a society not only would be helping the person out, we'd be saving money. That's probably the way to look at it. But of course, what that's done is we've identified 24 high-end users. We haven't really dealt with the entire vulnerable populations. I guess another way to look at this is countries that have been able to reduce the social and economic distance between rich and poor have also reduced the time in which people get sick and eventually die. And so if everybody in the society, you want to think, if everyone in the society gets sick and dies at about the same time, you not only have health equity, you've probably got a pretty equitable society. Like social relations are in probably pretty good shape. Now, sadly in Canada, a country that most of us have grown up believing is a just society, to quote a former Liberal Prime Minister, and the home of some of the most decent people in the world, we're a very long way from the goal of equity. And of course, this is especially true with the difference in health and in living conditions between Indigenous people and white Canadians. And in fact, that gap is more, I think in my book I called it more of a chasm than a gap. Just a few things to ponder, bring everybody down on a Thursday afternoon. In Canada, 1/2 of First Nations children live in poverty. In Saskatchewan, in my province, 64% of First Nations kids live under the poverty line, okay? So that's egregious in its own part, but here's something else to ponder, okay? And then again, this is from my province, and this is actually out of date, okay? So 64% of First Nations kids live in poverty, okay? Now, bad enough as that is, look at the decline of the Aboriginal proportion of the population. In fact, when I was looking at this, my text doesn't actually match this because there's a new demographic projection that says by 2050, 1/2 of Saskatchewan will be of Aboriginal ancestry. So what that means is, if you've got half of your population that's vulnerable, you're not only, like I said, human misery, you're going to bankrupt yourself. So we've got to deal with that. Now, with regard to Indigenous people, I've been trying to wrap my head around this, and maybe it's because these inequities have been around for so long, they're almost like white noise to us. We hear about crazy situations, some of us get upset, some of us protest, but as a society, we really haven't done that much, that much substantive. It's better to tune out things like Attawapiskat than to really think about the conditions that forced Chief Spence into phoning the Red Cross. Another example I guess I can give you is during the 2011 election campaign, Sean Atleo, who was then the president or the chief of the Assembly of First Nations, wrote an open letter. And I think he was desperately trying to get Indigenous issues on the table during the election campaign. I don't really think he was that successful because it didn't come up. But here are a few facts that he kind of laid on us. Infant mortality, 3 times the national average among Indigenous people. Tuberculosis rates, I'm very interested in tuberculosis, 30 times the national average. More than 100 communities don't have safe drinking water. This is one that got me, that a First Nations kid going to a reserve school has a greater chance of being imprisoned than finishing high school. Now, excuse me, that to me is insane, but it's probably more understandable when you think about the gap in education. There's probably a $3,000 to $4,000 per child gap between provincially funded children, mainstream kids, and federally funded First Nations schools. So think about it. In Saskatchewan, the average provincially funded child is 10 grand per child. Okay? On a reserve, it's between 6 and 7. If you've got 200 kids in your school and you've got a gap of $3,000 to $4,000, that's a huge sum of money you don't have to fix your roof, to deal with whatever kind of issues. And Maclean's magazine this summer talked about second-class children. They actually talked about how tough it was for people in positions of power to deal with this, or they even questioned whether they were really unwilling to do it because it was such a mess. So we're in a pretty bad situation, and I think actually in some ways things are getting worse. I told you about Dr. Q Young that I worked for probably 25 years ago at the medical school. One of my first jobs working as a medical historian. And in 1991, I'm just checking my date here. Yeah, 1991, he and a colleague wrote that diabetes was an emerging problem among First Nations people. This is 1991. And that medical funding, medical research funding has to be directed to type 2 diabetes because it's on the horizon. Okay, 25 years later, that was the tip of the iceberg. So right now in communities, we have, actually in some communities, the majority of people have type 2 diabetes. In Saskatchewan, the number of people with diabetes has exploded. And if any of you ever drive through a reserve, some of you may live on a reserve, if you, as you're driving through, keep an eye out for ramps, okay, instead of stairs going into the house, because if you see a ramp, that's a sign that there's probably a diabetes amputee in that house, and they've got to use a wheelchair to get down to their car. That's kind of a visual, evidence, I guess. So, while things weren't great for Canadians as a whole with regard to their health, Indigenous Canadians were even further behind. So when I wrote up, I guess one of the last drafts of Clearing the Plains, I used the United Nations Human Development Index, and I said how outrageous it was that if you use the same criteria, these are statistical values, basically the social determinants of health. If you use those values in 2008 with regard to First Nations people, they ranked 68th. Well, that Maclean's magazine did an update, and in 2014, First Nations conditions are now 72nd, on par with Romania. So it's almost like we're living in two different countries, even though we're neighbors. Okay? Safety, or the lack of it, is another measure of health that shows the stark contrast between these two solitudes. Indigenous and white in Canada, Aboriginal young people are in such despair, they're taking their lives in numbers that are hard to comprehend. A couple weeks ago, I had the pleasure of going to see Joseph Boyden. And if anyone has the opportunity, go see Joseph Boyden. In contrast to me, he's a true professional. Okay? But anyhow, Joseph Boyden was reading from the Orenda. He also read something he'd written about a friend of his who had a friend of his from Moosonee that had 2 children commit suicide. And he wrote a very beautiful piece on suicide, and he actually called it a suicide cult in Moosonee because those children felt, I don't know, so disheartened with such despair that they were actually appreciating the memorial so much. Some of them actually wanted to have a memorial about them after they were dead rather than continuing to live. So many scholars have talked about First Nations youth having probably the highest suicide rates potentially in the world. Also, I guess on the same topic, we've got more than 1,200 Aboriginal women missing and murdered across the country. And as you know, there's ongoing pressure for the government to call an inquiry. So far, the federal government's refused, and I almost think they know what the answers are. It's racism, it's poverty, violence, like the lack of safety. So maybe they just don't want to have to go through all that muckraking. Another sort of sign of this, and I'm not sure if you've seen this on the news, but in Winnipeg, families of missing and murdered women, almost under the shadow of the Human Rights Museum, have been dragging the Red River with their own boats, sort of in a desperate attempt to find the remains of their people who may be in the river. Like, it's pretty stark. So I guess my rhetorical question, did it have to be this way? And that's really one of the questions I tried to look at when I set out to write Clearing the Plains. Now, writing the book was a long journey, like I said, lazy and think slow, a whole bunch of other things. Probably took a lot of detours, a lot of dead ends. And one of the many lucky breaks I've had is about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, someone asked me to work on a climate change project with a bunch of scientists. And the question was, hey, do you think you could reconcile 1,000 years of climatic change with Indigenous cultural change on the Canadian prairies? Oh, sure. You got money for that? Yeah, no problem. I can do that. Okay. I realized what a big issue that was. But I got to spend probably 18 months doing nothing but learning about climate change and learning about cultural changes that happened in relation to changes in the weather. And because climate change in the last few years has been such a big topic, reconstructing the climate was actually no problem. Scientific journals have got that covered. And finally, in reconstructing the Indigenous past through archaeology, I got to use my Trent Anthro degree for something useful. Okay. So I guess working in this climate project, I think that's probably the most original contribution of the book, because it's stuff that I actually dug up rather than sort of quoting other people, but also potentially some of the most heretical things that I really haven't had any pushback on this. So just very briefly, I'll give you, an 800-year summary of climate and human adaptation in Eastern North America. Between 8 and 1,200 years ago, during a period of time called the medieval climatic optimum, from 800 to 1200 Common Era, okay, the northern hemispheric temperatures were actually warmer than they are now. So the weather was quite benign, okay? In that time, when I have a thing to change slides, in that time, okay, the largest city in North America, Cahokia, was built at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers, okay? And it was built over several hundred years. That mound probably rivals the pyramids of Egypt. Something else to think about, okay? That mound was built without the assistance of beasts of burden. There were no cattle. That was built with like people carrying baskets on their back, okay? This city, 20,000 people in the urban core, and suburbs and satellite communities and you name it, was the largest city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it in 1800. Also, the level and sophistication of, I guess, the unity of mindsets, the unity of artifacts, things we found or archaeologists have found since then. Some academics have argued that Cahokia was the capital of a state. So think of Cahokia as the capital of a country. That's how organized things were. Okay? Also around the Great Lakes, I just spoke to Dr. Newhouse. Okay? Around that time, the technology for agriculture, corn, beans, and squash spread to the Great Lakes. Okay? So the economy there changed. It also spread actually as far east as the Maritimes. The Algonquin-speaking people took up agriculture at that time. In the far north, I think I got another slide on that. Okay, a couple slides here. In the far north, okay, the ancestors of the people we know of as the Inuit, the Thule people, hunted in large boats, hunted whales in large boats because the Arctic Ocean was open for so long. This is an excavated Thule house, and you can see that the ribs of the house are made from whale bone. So they had a very actually, their communities were quite large, and like I said, they cooperated to hunt very large animals during this time. And actually, even the Thule people, during this warm period from 800 to 1200, expanded so far east, they actually encountered the Norse, who were taking advantage of the good weather, expanded west from Iceland into Greenland, and very briefly into Canada. On the prairies, that 400 years was marked by almost total stability. The archaeological record is very, very stable. There's only one sort of regional evolution, and that's something the archaeologists called Old Women's Phase. And most of the archaeologists, and I think even the Niitsitapi people, see that as the origin of the Niitsitapi or Blackfoot culture that sort of rose up and evolved from the other cultures sometime around 1000 AD. So if there was a golden age of Indigenous North America, I'm proposing to you folks that it happened between 8 and 1200 AD. Very soon after that, the climate changed very quickly and for the worst. Okay? Like I said, sometime in the 13th century, okay? In the aftermath, within 100 years, that huge city of Cahokia was totally abandoned. Okay? People probably kept doing the same things they've been doing. And even before, as I got a little joke in here, even I tell my first years, even before Columbus's parents looked up, Cahokia was abandoned. Okay? So it wasn't the impact of diseases, there was something else at play. Okay? Also, among the Iroquoian-speaking people, there was a period, probably a couple, 2 or 3 centuries, that unsustainable crops contributed to inter-community rivalry and eventually to warfare. And some have said that's the origin of the Longhouse culture because people were basically gathering together to protect themselves in this very dangerous environment. Okay? This is a picture of the killing fields at Crow Creek, South Dakota. These are the bodies of 500 people. Okay? They were killed, their bodies were mutilated, their village was burned down on top of them. Very soon after, the archaeologists have figured this out, there was a new community built by another group of people right on top of this bone bed. Excuse me. And what people have interpreted is that the location of Crow Creek was probably a microclimate, was probably really good for gardening. And in the aftermath of the abandonment of Cahokia and the other woodland cultures, the other woodland communities in the east, that this type of violence probably happened many, many times as huge waves of people moved from their unsustainable communities in the woodlands toward the west and the kind of the safety, the relative safety of the bison hunting. As I said, the Iroquoian-speaking people, okay, descended into probably a couple century cycle of violence and despair and sickness and malnutrition, and only sometime, I don't know, maybe in the last 500 years ago or so, the great peacemaker had a vision, brought everyone together under the image of the Tree of Peace, and set up what we know as the League of the Haudenosaunee. And that system has been in place for 500 years, so it's probably a sign of how sophisticated, how efficacious it was. And I've looked at it as an outsider, almost as an adaptation to climate change, because it's been so successful for so long. Okay? In the north, I don't know if that's slide or not, no. In the north, the Arctic Ocean became ever more covered with ice. So those Thule people who hunted whales in open boats were confronted with, ice coming in earlier and earlier every fall and staying later and later every spring. And eventually they shifted their focus from open boat whale hunting to seal hunting and sort of evolved over the course of many centuries into the people we would know as the Inuits today. And I got a note here, the Norse, who established themselves in Greenland and were growing crops in Greenland and even using irrigation, continued to try to farm in a European way during sort of the beginning of this little ice age. And over the course of generations, their cattle shrank, their crops shrank, and even their bodies shrank until the last of them probably died of slow, cold death sometime in the early 1400s. So things weren't great in the days before Columbus showed up. But I think when Columbus did happen to trip over the Bahamas, and I wrote a book review for actually environmental history this winter, and I was struck. It was about technology and how, for a very brief time, Northern Europe controlled the world through technology, advances in technology. And the writer was talking about Columbus didn't have a clue how far he was going. He didn't, it was the biggest, the most famous or infamous voyage in history was one of the biggest accidents in history. And I've often told my students, who knows how many other mariners sailed off the edge of the flat earth before Columbus managed to bump into the Bahamas. Okay? So, like I said, things weren't great, but the first encounter of Columbus with the Taino people in the Bahamas unleashed a chain of events that, I quoted somebody in the book, that could never be replicated unless we're visited by extraterrestrials and all of their biota. That was probably the biggest change in environment ever in the history of the world, when those two previously sort of separated ecosystems got together. Now, the most sudden of those impacts, and I've often talked about animals, plants, varmints, things like that, but within the span of a few weeks, in the transfer of old world diseases, of diseases of origin in Eurasia, potentially within 3 weeks, you may have had, and especially with regard to smallpox, the most deadly disease in human history. Okay? In the span of 3 weeks, during a virgin soil epidemic, what we academics call the first outbreak, no one's got an immunity. And you want to think about how severe this was. Think about what's happening in Africa right now. Okay? 80% of the people who aren't treated with, in those level 4 labs die. Okay? 80% of people who experienced the virgin soil epidemics of smallpox would have died. So think of the implications for that, and especially Indigenous societies in America, where the cultural values, the information, the morality, all of the coded knowledge was spread from generation to generation through words rather than writing. So in the span of less than 3 weeks, you have 80% of the elders who die, 80% of the babies die, 80% of the moms, 80% of the dads. So those societies are never really the same in the aftermath of that. So in the book I sort of recount the terrible period of 150 years where there are generational epidemics. But one thing to think about is when these terrible epidemics weren't breaking out, and I guess mercifully, they weren't all that often. In Western Canada, you can count the number of smallpox outbreaks, these big smallpox outbreaks, probably on one hand. Okay? And when these terrible outbreaks weren't breaking out, First Nations people were actually especially in my region, in the northern Great Plains, were some of the best fed people in the world. In fact, this is a reference to some physical anthropologists who did a study on people's skeletons, and they actually called them the tallest people in the world. And last summer I was in Swift Current, Saskatchewan at the museum giving a talk, and there was a reporter for the local paper who was like one of those 6'6" Dutch persons, okay? And he's like, even taller than the Dutch? And I said, well, they didn't say the second tallest people in the world. So when First Nations people, like I said, in between those terrible epidemics, people were in very, very good shape. And it's just an example. Another thing, and we probably all know this, societies that subsisted on bison for millennia used bison for their clothing, used bison for their housing, and I didn't know this, but this, actually, if you look sideways, this is a photo of Chief Mountain. If you can use your imagination, there's actually sort of a shape of a chief. Someone told me this at a conference one time. So this photo is actually from Montana. But you can think of how sanitary, how hygienic teepee living was. In fact, I was going to put a slide in here of the early 20th century when people in Toronto or in other sort of Western cities, if somebody had TB in your house, you would actually put them in a tent to recreate the conditions of a teepee. Bed rest and fresh air, that was as good as the medical intervention could do. Now, so this is essentially the situation when probably the largest real estate transaction in human history took place in 1869-70. As any of you guys who've been through grade 6 probably know, this is when the Dominion of Canada purchased the Royal Charter from Hudson's Bay Company for £300,000. Okay, and you can see just what a vast territory that was. Okay, now, okay, there was one impediment, of course, was that even though the deed, the legal deed, had been purchased by Canada from the Hudson's Bay Company, there was an acknowledgement, probably since England took possession of the territory in 1763, that Indigenous people actually owned the territory, right? That's set forth in the Royal Proclamation with lands reserved for Indians. So before any real settlement could take place in the West, Canadian officials had to complete a number of treaties, and this is sort of a colored representation of those treaty areas. Okay, and I've often told people it wasn't a great policy. They didn't have a big vision for expansion at this time. It was essentially the treaty party would leave Winnipeg by wagon or by canoe or by steamboat in the case of Treaty 5, go up and put out some kind of local issue. Okay, and then they resolve that issue, go back for the winter, and then head back out. And needless to say, there were plenty of issues in the early 1870s. What I want to tell you about is the negotiations leading up to the completion of Treaty 6. And this is a rendition I got from Glenbow Archives. And what it represents is, you can see there's a First Nations person speaking to the treaty commissioner who's under the tent. Something to think about Treaty 6. Okay? It was negotiated at Fort Carleton. Fort Carleton is a really nice history park, sort of halfway between Saskatoon and Prince Albert, if you can imagine it. Okay? And the negotiations took place in the late summer of 1876. Okay? Just 2 or 3 months after Custer and the 7th Cavalry lost their lives at the Battle of Little Bayport. That's only a few hundred kilometers south of where Fort Carleton was. Okay? So the way I've talked about this is, as the treaty party comes to Fort Carleton, okay, and my friend Walter Hildebrand wrote an article about this, the Northwest Mounted Police were ordered, and there's only a couple hundred Mounties at this time, they were ordered to go to Fort Carleton and show up and represent the power of Queen Victoria. Like they probably had, their pith helmets or their pillbox hats, and they were on one side of the encampment. You could just see them, polishing their guns, not pointing their guns, but just showing up and, as they're doing whatever they're guns. But what I've explained to my students is, probably on the other side of the camp, the Plains Cree were probably doing something very similar. They're just, cleaning their guns, everything's cool, nobody's pointing their guns. But both groups showed up at Fort Carleton and were there to portray the power of their nations. Okay? And so the negotiations at Fort Carleton and the completion of Treaty 6 was probably was the most sophisticated of the number treaties anyways. And it was undertaken, like I said, nation to nation from positions of mutual strength over the course of 3 days. And so the aftermath of this 3 days is that there were a few innovations. One of them was something that has been the bane of lawyers and social policy people for 140 years, and that's the medicine chest clause. Just 6 years earlier, in 1869-70, 3,000 to 3,500 First Nations people, mostly Niitsitapi people and Cree people, died in the last of those sort of open fire smallpox epidemic. So as the commissioners are being invited out, and sometimes they're, we know you're coming anyway, so when you come out, we would like your medical assistance. So there's a negotiation about medical assistance. And what ends up happening is, the wording of the treaty is, we will put a medicine cabinet at the home of the Indian agent. In 1876, that was probably the state of the medical art. There were probably 2 or 3 physicians in the West at most. Another of the innovations was extra assistance with regard to agriculture. And my friend Sarah Carter has written an awesome book, Lost Harvest. If anybody wants to follow what happened to Indigenous agriculture, they should check that book out. It was written 20 years ago, but it still stands the test of time. The clause of the treaty, the innovation that I looked at, was something called the Famine and Pestilence Clause. And I'm actually kind of surprised that scholars haven't paid more attention to this. And the backstory of this is, at the negotiations, there was a holdout named Chief Beardy. And Beardy's in Okemasis Reserve, not too far from Fort Carlton, is named after him. And what he told the treaty commissioner was, I'm very concerned about the future of the bison. And if the bison disappear, I am concerned if we make a treaty with you and we don't put this in, that we're going to die like dogs. And there's a back and forth between Alexander Morris and Chief Beardy. No, we're not going to feed you every day, but if a great, if a great famine befalls the Indians, to use the old term, the Crown will grant the Indians assistance in such character, necessary and sufficient to relieve the Indians from the calamity that shall befall them. Sorry about that. Okay. So what that means is, in the terms of the treaty, if there's a famine, the government took on the responsibility, the moral and potentially the financial responsibility for what would happen. Okay? Nobody planned, nobody foresaw what would happen probably in 18 months. Okay? In the spring of 1878, okay, the bison disappeared from the prairies in great herds forever. Okay? This is just a sign of how many bison died in those days. Okay? That's a gentleman standing on top of a mountain of bison skulls. I don't know, it's like, pick the number of candy. I bet you there are 100,000 bison skulls or more in there. Okay? And very briefly, during the early days of the railroad, there was kind of a macabre cottage industry of people picking up bones. This is after the railway was built, obviously, sending them back to Ontario where the bones were ground into things like bone china and probably used for fertilizer and industrial uses and stuff like that. Okay? This is another one, 40,000 buffalo hides. Okay? Could you imagine what that would smell like out in the open prairies? And another thing to think about, we think of overhunting for food, Métis bison hunt and stuff like that. The greatest pressure on the bison was actually the demand, the Industrial Revolution demand for bison hides for factories. You know those belts that used to tear off children's arms during the Charles Dickens books? Those were probably bison hide belts that drove those machines. So obviously there's a whole bunch of reasons, including the American military's pacification strategy of why the bison disappeared. But very soon after, like I said, in the spring of 1878, everyone is surprised that there's no food. This is just an image of the canny waiting for rations. And the Mounties, who were sent out west as advocates of First Nations people, they shut down the whiskey trade upon their arrival. And during this time, the evidence, the reports, is like there's genuine concern. Like they're really worried about what's going to happen. But like I said, the famine was very deep and very widespread. And I just cut and pasted this today. This is from just before Christmas. The Saskatchewan Herald was the first newspaper in the Northwest Territories. Okay? And for those of you in the back, I'm not sure if you can read this. I'll be one of those guys who reads the slides. Okay? This isn't in the news. This is on page 4. I read every issue of the Saskatchewan Herald from its inception in 78 probably to 91. It's 4 pages. This is something just before Christmas 1878. Found where the Indians starved to death about the 1st of October, a white mare. The owner can have same by proving property, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So in this white person, you'll see there's some very racist accounts from this newspaper I'm going to show you. By Christmas of 1878, it's not news that people are starving. It's news that Buddy found a horse where the people had starved. Okay, so that's probably a sign of the lack of humanity at that time, but also it's a sign of how bad things are with regard to the famine. Okay? Things take on a different tone in the fall of 1878. As you guys know, or people who are Canadian history buffs, such as myself, okay, Johnny McCallum is re-elected to power in the fall of 1878 on the national policy. And the response to the famine really takes on a different tone because, as we all know with regard to the national policy, MacDonald committed himself to building a railway as quickly as possible. And my friend Joyce Green, who's just retired from the U of R, has written that the unstated principle of the national policy was the subjugation of the First Nations people, essentially getting the hell out of the way of the railway. Okay? This is just another quote, and even sort of the racist newspaper talks about, and this is from June 30th, 1879. The condition of these Indians is deplorable in the extreme, accustomed all their lives to a diet consisting largely of animal food. Rations of flour and tea they receive leave them but one removed from starvation. So one removed from starvation is obviously like a beautiful Victorian way of saying they are right on the brain. Okay? And I'd just like to show you guys this. I hope this doesn't bore anyone. This is an image I got from Glenville Warehouse. And what it is it represents how rations were doled out in the early reserve period. So you can see these women, they're all in line, they're behaving themselves very well, because if you've got if you made a fuss, you probably got kicked out of the ration house. This is an Indian Affairs employee, and he's got a list, and these women would report, okay, my name is so-and-so, I have whatever number of children I have, and he would weigh the flour and give them exactly how much flour. And I'll give you an example here, I got one, 12 ounces of flour a day, okay? And then these ladies would go over to the butcher, you can see the guy's got the scale, and then he would know how many ounces of bacon, and for example, 4 ounces of bacon a day. So each of these ladies would go through, get their rations for the day, but it was very intentional that no more than the absolute minimum of rations. And one removed from starvation, I told you about the 11 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of bacon. On that ration, 3 people starved to death at Fort Ellis in January 1881. So the government is providing the absolute bare minimum of food. And even as the reserve population is teetering on the brink of starvation, thousands of people are succumbing, they're immune suppressed because they've been so hungry for so long. The rations bought by the Dominion, like they're bought by the government, they're sent from Fort Benton in the United States where the ranching economy was pretty well established. They're being kept in warehouses on reserve. They're beginning to rot because they're being stockpiled rather than distributed to the hungry. So there are many, many cases, and I think I got one here. This is actually a farm instructor who's writing in despair to his bosses. In fact, he didn't even have stationery, Indian Affairs stationery. He's asking for stationery in the same letter. So he's very under-resourced. And what he says is, he's talking about the pork at Touchwood Hills being rusty and musty, totally unfit for use. We're giving it out to the Indians in the absence of anything better, but we can't use it ourselves. So he's imploring his boss to send him some food that he and his family can eat, because right now there isn't any good food to eat. Okay? Elsewhere, and there are several references to it in Clearing the Plains, Indian Department employees are actually commended, like their bosses are like, good job, that showed initiative, that you re-cured the bacon that had spoiled on reserve, and you re-smoked it, and like we managed to recycle used bacon. Of course, if you think of it from a health perspective, it's essentially poison. And there's one case I wrote up in Clearing the Plains where more than 100 people who were working for rations were given rancid bacon, and they died. That's one of the reasons why Chief Piapot left his appointed reserve and moved to the Capel Valley. There are also many, many reports in the newspapers and in Indian Affairs reports and government records of people being so hungry that they ate animals that had died of disease. This is just one image of probably a tubercular cow. And of course, even in 1880, the writer of the newspaper knew that if you were malnourished and ate a sick animal, there was a very good chance that you too were going to get sick. Okay? Also, no one had really planned, like they were providing for people at a very minimal level, but no one had made a contingency for clothing. So very soon on, probably the next year after the famine broke out, people didn't have shoes. And there are government reports, I've actually got one here. The poor people were naked. This is in winter of 1880. The poor people were naked, the cold intense, and remained so during the whole year. So people are literally walking around during the winter without shoes on. They're malnourished, and the quote goes on, they ate their horses, all the dogs were destroyed for food. So you can see how this is truly a famine. As MacDonald's right-hand man Edgar Newton made his way to the new territorial capital of Regina, he passed through the Siksika Reserve, the Blackfoot Reserve. And in his diary, like it was his first time going through, he reported that 1,300 people were on the verge of starvation, that's his words. And then later on he said, strong young men, now so weak that some of them could barely walk. And this one? Yeah. So I cut and pasted this one. Obviously you can't read it, I can barely read it up here. But this is a cut and paste job from the Saskatchewan Herald. Over 25 had died of actual starvation from the camp at Blackfoot Crossing. So the newspaper, even in its unsympathetic way, is reporting that people are actually dying of famine. Okay? So within a couple of years of the famine breaking out, First Nations people are in a terrible situation. TB, which had been very, very rare, was the primary cause of sickness and death. Probably, more, I don't know, in the long run, more importantly, is that with the loss of food supply from the Bison, First Nations people lost their balance of power, lost their position of power in that balance. So as they became dependent on rations, they were under the thumb of government officials. And the government officials, I think their primary directive was getting them the hell out of the way of the railway. And actually, without me being a conspiracy theorist, John A. Macdonald laid this out in the House of Commons. And what he said on March 24th, and he discussed all of the quote-unquote Indian trouble south of the proposed line in Assiniboia. And what he said was, all of the First Nations people south of the proposed line in the territory of Assiniboia, which is southwestern Saskatchewan, would be removed, and someone else, like by force, that's in another quote, from the land south of the proposed railway. So they didn't have to use force. What they did was, any First Nation person who was south of the railway tracks was not provided with food. And the outcome of that was within a year, 5,000 people were essentially starved out of the Cypress Hills. Okay? So the outcome in 2014, okay, I'm not sure if you can see this in the back. Each of these triangles represents a reserve, a First Nations community. And I think in Saskatchewan there's 78 of them. So you can see the cluster here in the Capel Valley. Those reserves were taken up before the famine, often by a different group of people. But I'd like you to look at, this is the territory. This line here represents basically the TransCanada Highway, which runs parallel to the Canadian Pacific Railway. Okay? These are the northern Great Plains, probably some of the best bison hunting territory in America at one time. Okay? Out of 78 communities, there were only 2 reserves in that territory that McDonald referred to. Okay? The first one is a very small Treaty 4 community. It's a Creek community called Nikanit. Chief Nikanit didn't actually get to see that community get reserve status because it wasn't granted until the First World War. Wood Mountain is a very, very small Dakota community, so it's a non-treaty community. They didn't get reserve status until the 1920s. So by the time those 2 reserves were granted, that whole area was settled. And about a month ago, I gave a talk in Edmonton, and it was very interesting. It was half First Nations people who were nodding because they know this story. It's not a great surprise. But there were a whole bunch of kind of oil company executives, for lack of a better term, but a whole bunch of white people on one side. And one of the guys out there finished talking about this and showed this map. He's like, I feel like I've been kicked in the guts. And he was like really concerned. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Well, he come from a farm in Kindersley. And he grew up, and it was like he's a lawyer, like he's a very thoughtful person. And when he grew up, he found arrowheads, he found teepee rings, he found all kinds of archaeological evidence of occupation, like he knew that people had lived here. But he hadn't really made the connection between the people who left all of that stuff on his land, or his family's land, and the people who were forced to move, 150, 200 kilometers away. So that was actually kind of a revelation to him, and not a very good one. So he's been thinking about that. Now, another thing, and I guess something else to think of, is that food was provided to people if they would leave the Cypress Hills and move to their communities around Battleford. So there's a whole cluster of First Nations communities around Battleford. And actually, I gave a talk. I was invited to give talks to First Nations schools in Little Pine and Pound Liquor and in Battleford itself. And it wasn't very easy talking about this story because Little Pine was one of the chiefs who was starved out of the Cypress Hills. So I'm telling these kids on Little Pine, yeah, the origin of your community was you were starved into coming here. And here's another one. I'm pretty sure you can't read that, so what I'll do is, once First Nations people retired, retreated, whatever word you were starved onto their reserves, they're essentially under the thumb of the Indian agent. Okay? And the next couple slides, which I apologize for being poor quality, represent what the kind of power First Dominion officials had over those people. Okay? So this is a reference to Chief Poundmaker, who's quite a famous chief out west. And what it says here, I'll just read it to you because you probably can't. He's been a troublemaker ever since his visit to the South last spring, and his opposition to the department has been strong. So what they did was, his band has been stricken off the ration roll. So what happened in this slide, and in a couple of these slides, is if there's any, not even pushback, not even dissent, if there's any questioning of Indian Department authority, the communities, like the chief and their communities, are cut off the ration rolls for 8 days. So imagine, you're already malnourished, and then you're cut off for 8 days. So, well, it's an abuse of power, obviously, but think of the terrible situation people would be in. Okay? Another one is very soon after 1885, and again, most people know about the Saskatchewan insurrection. Okay? This is a pass, okay? And from 1885 to 1951, I'm not sure what the situation was in Eastern Canada, but in Western Canada, any treaty Indian who was found off the reserve without this type of pass signed by the Indian agent would either be taken by force back to the reserve, or they could be imprisoned. Okay, so this is a gentleman who's allowed to go game hunting for 2 weeks in 1932. Okay, here's how the pass system was imposed. Okay, so there's a daily, and this is from the Saskatchewan newspaper, daily patrol, and what they do is there's a posse of deputized people who travel around the community of Battleford, and what they do, this one here is, they find an Indigenous woman, they drag her back to the police station as a posse of white men, they cut her hair, and like lots of her hair were taken from her temples, sort of partial fashionable bob or something like that, okay? And then they let her go. So they terrorize this woman, cut off her hair, and let her loose, and of course she spreads the word, and you know, in the newspapers report, the town is cleared of stragglers, you know, within hours, because people are terrorized and they're scared out of town. Okay? Now, as all this thing is happening, First Nations communities descend into like such a terrible cycle of tuberculosis that when there was an influenza pandemic in 1891, many of the Saskatchewan bands on reserve actually had such a high mortality rate that was the absolute bottoming out of their population. Really, that's where I stopped clearing the plains, because things have been changing very, very slowly ever since. So I've got a picture of MacDonald here, and MacDonald oversaw this as he was preparing for imminent settlement and the construction of the railroad. MacDonald was re-elected to power in 1878, but as I said, or I hope I said, he was the Minister of Indian Affairs while this whole program took place. So one of those uncomfortable truths I got to share with you is I really don't know how to reconcile that, or how to commemorate MacDonald. His bicentennial, the bicentennial of his birth is coming up in a couple of months. I think it's going to be in January. And it's going to be really interesting to see how he's commemorated. Of course, the federal government is probably going to have a parade or something like that. Okay? But here's an example. And again, I got this from the House of Commons. So MacDonald is overseeing this ration program where people are actually starving to death while they're being provided with rations. MacDonald is being criticized by the Liberal Party for spending too much money on food. So what he says in Parliament, again, I'm one of those guys who reads the slides, we can't allow them to die for want of food. We're doing all we can by refusing until the Indians are on the verge of starvation to reduce the expense. So what he's saying is, we're keeping these guys right on the edge. And there's another quote, I don't have a slide for it, but another comment he made is, we're being rigid, even stingy with regard to rations. Proof of starvation is required before food is distributed. So what he's doing is, he's showing that he's fiscally conservative. He's also showing he's not very humane. Now, something else, I got just a few slides, and I was talking to somebody. Andy Wernick is still around, he's retired, and I was Andy Wernick's worst student in cultural studies, bar none. But one of the things I learned in cultural studies was to to sort of critically assess images, to think about what images mean at a whole bunch of different levels, okay? So as First Nations people are being starved onto reserve and having all these terrible things done to them, the railway is completed, and there's basically you know, an advertising policy that's drawn many of our ancestors, at least those of us who live in the West, from Europe, and they're displaced people, poor people in Europe. And what they're doing is, they're selling Canada as free land. Own your own home in Canada. The right land for the right man. I got a million of them, okay? Canada, your land for the asking. So when the settlers came, the land was free because the state had pretty much intervened and cleared the land for them. Free farms for the million. Okay? This one kind of gets me, you know, Canada West. Last best West. Okay. And this one, oh, again, my poor quality here. Okay, the key to prosperity. You can see the key and the fresher, okay, in the breadbasket of the world, okay? And I'm not from Saskatchewan, like I said, I'm from Timmins, Ontario. And when I went to grad school in Manitoba, some of my colleagues were from Saskatchewan, and they referred to this, they referred to Tommy Douglas and the creation of the New Jerusalem and like a utopia out in the prairies, okay? Another thing I've had to reconcile is, okay, our identity is the breadbasket of the world, but that breadbasket of the world is grounded on famine. Like, what the hell? Like, how do we deal with that? Okay? Now, excuse me, I've gone off script here. Now, one thing I'd like to share with you, or actually there's a couple things I'd like to share with you. We should know this, okay? One of the things I've gotten a lot of recognition for is basically the starving out of the people from the Cypress Hills. People really didn't know that. They didn't know about what I've been calling the ethnic cleansing of southwestern Saskatchewan. But that article was written up by John L. Tobias in 1983. That was one of the first things I read in grad school. So something for us as academics, I know we've got a different, different crowds in here, but as academics, and I mean this politely, we haven't done a very good job of getting the word out to the public, because there isn't. I think the public, even as ugly as this story is, the public wants to hear this. You know, they want to know. So, in one sense, that's our responsibility as academics to get that word out. So, any grad students out here, theory's a lot of fun. It's cool to be in the in crowd and know all the stuff. But if you can't explain it to somebody, you got to be careful, because we're limited. Like, we're almost limiting what our influence can be with regard to society. Another sort of inconvenient, or I was going to say inconvenient truth, or to paraphrase Tom King, is this stems from another crazy thing that's happened in the last year. Last September, I was invited to be the white speaker at Black History Month. Pretty cool, okay? Also, it was the Francophone African Society of Saskatchewan, okay? There's been, because the world has gone insane, Saskatchewan's economy is booming, like I said, and there's been a huge wave of immigration of sub-Saharan Africans who speak French. So they invited me to their talk, and what they asked me to speak on was apartheid ici et ailleurs, okay? Apartheid here and away. And there was one of my colleagues in the French department is ethnically Nigerian, so it was just in the aftermath of Nelson Mandela dying. He talked about Mandela's time in prison and the ANC, and sort of that arc, and how South Africa is not, a utopian society by any means, but African people are free, or the Black Africans are free to at least, do things to each other or themselves. Or whatever. Like they don't have, immigrant power over top of them. When I spoke, and I had to scratch my head a little bit with regard to this topic, I ended up talking about the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is a race-based act in Canada. It's been in play since 1876. It's still in force in 2014. So I just explained to these guys in my own grade 7 version of French. Darlene will probably recognize my French. Okay. What I said was, the state controls people's identity. The state controls everything that happens on the reserve. The state-controlled movement. And I showed that pass to a group of Africans who had just come to Canada, and they thought that this was the best country ever. Okay, and their jaws literally dropped. It's like, what? Like, some people come from South Africa, right? And there was a different reason to have a pass system in South Africa. But that really took the gloss off. And my conclusion was, in contrast to Dr. Ado, who just spoken about the ANC, I wasn't very optimistic because I won't say most of us in this room, I'm probably singing to the choir here, but many of us in Canada, when we hear of a crazy situation like Attawapiskat, we think it's a crooked chief, or we think it's some kind of corruption. We don't really think about the structural impediments to progress and the lack of, progress on a lot of those things. So that's another one. And here's the last one I'm just going to read you. And this is something I should have known. Anybody who's taken Gender Studies 100, I haven't taken it, but I've heard about it. Okay? And this has been something that's really confronted me. Okay? I've been, I worked hard, don't get me wrong, okay? But I've been really acclaimed. I've sold 10,000 books with 3 more on the way. As Chris said, I've won a bunch of national awards. Things are awesome. But one of the things I've been confronted with, and actually I'll tell you a story before I tell you my punchlines, okay? About a year ago, I was invited to a very mixed audience at Station 20 West in Saskatoon. West side of Saskatoon is kind of the Aboriginal neighborhood, okay? So it was a very mixed crowd. So I was invited, okay, to speak, and there was a friend of mine, Corey Newdorf, who's from Sphere, a very activist physician, spoke, and an Indigenous scholar, Verna St. Dennis, spoke as well. Okay, so we're all ready to give our talks, and it was all about my book. I was really kind of honored. And there was an elder who said a few words and said a prayer, and then another man came up and sang an honor song. I'd never had an honor song before one of my talks. And then he told the crowd, you guys pay attention to this, because this is important, okay? And I'm sitting there like, oh, this actually is important, you know? And so I gave my 5-minute talk, Corey spoke and Verna spoke, and then we had a series of questions. And at the end, I'm glad handing people, I'm signing books. And there's an Indigenous woman who came up to me, shook my hand, I'm signing her book, and she said, thank you for writing this book. So I'm kind of, I'm joking, like, oh, well, thanks, I did my best. And then she said, thank you for being white in writing this book, okay? So I'm signing, I'm not really in the critical thinking headspace, and she could tell that the mouse was turning the wheel in my brain, because I was like, what? Okay? And she said, if we had written this, people would just say we're complaining, okay? Now I know that, but that really forced me to know that. And that situation, that conversation has been repeated, I'm not kidding, 5 or 6 times in the last year. In fact, just about a month ago, I had the honor to eat a meal with the former chief of the Piikani Nation. And he's an elder, he's an older guy, he's in his 70s. So he's almost like, hey kid, keep up the good work because they're not listening to us. So you're doing okay, so keep it up, okay? And so again, this is one of those situations. So the hard question, and like I said, I'm on my way to Rideau Hall to get a medal from the Governor General for pointing out that Johnny MacDonald committed crimes against humanity. That's kind of an insane situation. Here's something I want to leave you guys with. Okay, the hard question, like I said, I've been asking myself, and maybe we could have a conversation about this, is would the reception to Clearing the Plains, the exact same words that I wrote, if an Indigenous woman had written that, would the reception be the same? So I'd like you to think about that. And I just want to leave you with one more thought, and maybe with a whole bunch of one more thoughts. Okay, I've been able to tell you my story and the story of the book. I think what I'd like to share with you very briefly is the story of this young Inuit woman, Loretta Saunders, who, driven from a sense of social justice, was pursuing her honors in criminology at St. Mary's in Nova Scotia. And she was researching missing and murdered Indigenous women. I told you what a big problem that was. Okay? Well, we'll never get to hear her story because she was murdered last winter. So I'm going to leave you with that terrible thought, and thank you very much for listening.